I'll read a quick bio about Daniel. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Demon, as well as Freedom, Kill Decision, and his newest book, Influx. Former systems analyst to Fortune 1000 companies, Daniel has designed and developed software for the defense, finance, and entertainment industries. He's a past speaker at TED Global, MIT Media Lab, NASA Ames, the Long Now Foundation, Microsoft, Amazon, and he was at South by Southwest earlier this week. He lives in LA. Welcome, Daniel.
All right, well, thank you. Oh, it's always good to visit Google. I always love this. So the new book. What I'll do before we start is just briefly describe the new book. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read it. This book, Influx, is a bit more sci-fi than my previous books. For those familiar with my work, I tend to do tech thrillers that are just over the horizon, very near term. And in this particular book, I was trying to capture something that was, to me, a larger trend, and I wanted to write it on a really epic stage. So I was using more sci-fi elements, anti-gravity fusion, artificial intelligence, immortality, my God, yeah, a whole bunch of things. So Influx is the story of a very talented young physicist who conceives of a gravity mirror, a technology that can reflect gravity in various directions. And rather than get a Nobel Prize, he's grabbed by a secretive group that is trying to prevent disruptive technologies from rapidly altering society. They're fearful of the social ramifications of it. And that's really what I was trying to get at in this story, was this impulse to preserve the status quo that humans have. And we've seen shades of it. If we go back through history, we see in the 1600s, the efforts by the church at the time to stop the spread of the printing press, or the telescope, for instance, would be a good example. But we can fast forward to today. We were just talking about Tesla and efforts to stop that car company from doing business in various areas without franchise operations. Also, let's see, the Comcast Time Warner deal. It's another example of preserving status quo. So a little less violent than the Third Inquisition, but similar impulse. So that's really why I wrote this book, was to study that particular impulse of human nature and to do it in a very exciting story. That was the goal. So here I am.
Nice. Thanks a lot for coming. Can you talk a little bit about that difference about writing a book that's sort of about near-term technology versus something more sci-fi?
Yeah.
Some of the differences from your experience of writing it?
Sure. What I would do is, typically when I'm writing a book, I will do an immense amount of research on the topic I'm interested in. And for those who remember Kill Decision, my last book on drones, for instance, autonomous drones, I read lots of books on swarming intelligence. I examined lots of technologies for how to get drones to work together, all of that stuff. And that's very realistic stuff. For this book, the elephant in the room for me was anti-gravity. In other words, I foolishly created this brand where I have very, very authentic technologies in my book, and then I set about writing an anti-gravity story. That makes it tough. And so I did a lot of research on theoretical physics, and then I finally sat down with some physicists and tried to pester them into finding some gray area in knowledge of gravitation where I could put this technology for my story. And basically, I sat down with two people, and one in particular. What I wanted to do was to make it so that a physicist or somebody who is at least knowledgeable about science could read this book and enjoy it, that they could see that it is often a theoretical area we're not sure of just yet. And generally the way I did this was I would keep on making suggestions by talking with this physicist friend at JPL, and whenever he'd say, that's highly improbable, I would say, but there's a chance. And then we would go from there. So I absolved him of all my crimes against physics in the acknowledgments, just so that he's not embarrassed to go to work. It's like I had nothing to do with that. But that's, for instance, how I would try to do that. I really try to go that extra mile so that even if you have a pretty good grasp of how the world, the universe functions, how gravitation functions, that you can go with it. Now, some folks have brought up to me that at the beginning of the book, there's parts that are a little dense on the science. It's like a little fence around the story that once you step into it, it's much more accessible. But I wanted to get that out of the way early on. I wanted to establish my bona fides that I'd done this research, that the story is grounded to the degree that it can be in reality, so that when we then go off into the more fantastical elements, you feel that you're in capable hands. So that would be one example. And artificial intelligence, same process, essentially. I bother experts until I finally find an area where I can hide where I'm going to begin my story.
Sure. Now, some of the technologies that are in Influx, like quantum computing and nanotechnology, those are a little bit closer to, like there's no gravity mirrors out there being created probably right now, but there are people working on quantum computing and nanotech and to some extent different types of AI technologies. So I guess for any of those, how did you think about those, and how did you research those, which are sort of closer to where we are now?
Well, those to me, again, the antagonists of the story, the BTC, the Bureau of Technology Control, has supposedly been around since the 60s. So whereas we'd say, well, we're working on quantum computers now, they'd say, well, we were doing that in the 70s. It's kind of the ongoing joke that cancer had been cured back in '85, and so these guys are sort of looking back at a past we didn't live, and that's the dramatic or the sci-fi conceit of it. So researching that, a lot of what I was doing was using things that we're experiencing now as if they're in the distant past for these folks. For instance, the fusion parts, the tokamak designs, the magnetic containment vessels, all of that stuff. They're still working on that with ITER. Very similar design. We just simply make it so that they have solved those problems and then shrunk them down by several orders of magnitude. But also part of that research involved going up to the National Ignition Facility and touring that. And I don't know if anybody's ever gone to that. Man, amazing. It's first of all, it looks like Dr. No's lair. It just does. You go around, complete with the guys with the overalls and the hard hats, and all they're missing are little machine guns, and they look like the drones. But really amazing facility, and I'll describe it very briefly. National Ignition Facility is a very different fusion experiment that is being done at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. It's 192 of the most powerful lasers ever created, all focused onto a little pea-sized target. Now, bear in mind, each one of these lasers is the biggest ever built. So they built one, and then they said, let's build 191 more. And they focused them all on this spot. And for that, about a billionth of a second, they will use the equivalent of all of the electricity being used at that moment in the United States and focus it right on this target. To achieve, the goal is fusion for a billionth of a second. And they want to do that 10 times a second, like an engine, to create not a sustainable fusion reaction, but one that bursts, produces more energy briefly than is put into it, and that energy is fed back into the lasers, and then it just keeps on running a turbine. They just, about a month ago, got more energy out of it than they've put into it. So that was a real watershed moment. It made the news briefly. I think it might have been a little too complex for a lot of people to notice the importance of it, but I was like, yeah, all right. And people were looking at me strange. It's like, that's really big to be able to run the city of San Francisco on 2 gallons of seawater for a year. That would be a big deal. Now, pointedly, for this story, what I found so interesting in that is the goal. They have patents on all of this, but the goal is that they want to make these patents freely available to the world, to mankind, to solve our energy problem once and for all. And this is really the exact opposite of what the BTC would be doing. So I was very, very proud as a taxpayer to say that was the goal of that facility, to say, if we solve the energy problem once and for all of history, we're going to give it to mankind for free. So it's an amazing facility. If you ever get a chance to go see it, go see it. It's really cool.
Sounds really cool. So if there is no real BTC out there that's trying to block good technologies, what do you think could be slowing down the pace of innovation, or not, or I guess making really hard problems take so long to solve?
Yeah. Well, just to be clear, I'm not one of the tinfoil hat people. I don't believe there is a BTC out there trying to stop technology and hiding immortality and all of these other things. That was really a metaphor for that impulse. If, for instance, I described it in this story as I think it's happening, which is a lot of boring meetings in boardrooms where people are trying to protect vested interests, economic investments, that's not a very exciting book. So I wanted to make it a bit more sci-fi. But I think a lot of the time it is. It's preservation. And this is, I think, a completely natural impulse. When there is a substantial investment in an existing market, I think there's a lot of reluctance to disrupt it. And I think this has been going on throughout history, not just economic, but also political power. Preserving the status quo is a very strong impulse. But I don't know, I would say that change, as disruptive as it is, the ability to ride change and to adapt to it is the only thing that's going to sustain civilization. We've seen this, the efforts to preserve our fossil-based fuel systems are in many ways killing us. Now we have to make that change. It's going to be a very disruptive change. How many industries are going to disappear and change? How many careers are going to go away? How many various classes of society are going to see that disruption? But that, I think, embracing that is really the only course for the human race. And it seems obvious, but then when you go do it, that's when the problem happens. And that's the reason why I think we have this inertia. Is all of this invested energy and science into what we were doing. And sometimes it's very difficult to unplug that. I'll give you a great example. Again, up at the National Ignition Facility, after you see this terrific tour and you feel very confident about it, they sit you down and they say, now, let's say it works perfectly right now. Let's say we can have fusion right this second. They proceed to show you how it will be immensely difficult in the next 25 to 30 years to roll that out around the world, to change the existing system, even if it were available right now, and what that means to all the particulate matter in the atmosphere now. So pretty much it is already going to be a tremendous challenge. So again, embracing change at a very basic level, how we get energy is number one, and we're having difficulty doing that even in the face of tremendous evidence we should be. So that's how I think it manifests itself, is a bit of fear, and then also an immense practicality that has been probably evolved into us over many millions of years, that once you have a good thing, try to keep it going as long as possible. And in a world where technology can rapidly change the world, we almost have to rewire ourselves to embrace change a bit more.
Sure. Cool. Now, you began writing in Flux before all the Snowden stuff came out. And obviously the topic of surveillance and privacy has gotten pretty big over the last couple of years. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that and how it might apply to Google as well.
Sure. I go to DEF CON and Black Hat a lot, and I think for a lot of IT security people, the revelations about the NSA were not such a surprise. I think that a lot of data exists out there well, let's face it, a lot of the products being used, a lot of the way consumer information moves through society, that's really not the profit incentive, but that's the economic model increasingly. And I think that to the extent that we're all carrying these devices we love, we sort of have a love-hate relationship with them. And I love my smartphone. And at the same time, I'm conflicted about the fact, I don't know how many times I'll be hovering over this EULA agreement going, they need that? Really? Oh, really? And I really sit down and think, how far am I willing to agree to this? And I think we've reached the point that now as a society, we sort of have to establish what that baseline is. Again, these technologies have rolled out so quickly that society didn't really get a chance to decide. Instead, these applications and the networks arose. People found tremendous utility with them. And now we as a society have to come to an agreement about what that baseline is. I think there's no doubt that we like them. I think everybody wants to have a more informed decision about how they get to use them. And I will fess up that I read very few EULAs all the way through. Wasn't there an end-user license agreement? I can't remember the company, but they had an award of, I think, $5,000. Like if you get all the way down to like paragraph 95 and you read this, it's like just email here and we'll give you $5,000. The first person and one person claimed it. Nobody reads EULAs. But they're essentially these social contracts. And that's why I'm saying if we read one, basically, as something that we establish as a civilization, what we're willing to put up with, and then I think a lot of it can follow that. But I don't know. Privacy, when you design a network that is inherently sharing information, all that rich information, it doesn't surprise me when people use it. Has anyone here seen the MIT's reality mining application? Nobody? Anybody? This is a research project that was done for about 1,000 cell phones. And what they would do is they would get respondents to agree to have their geolocation tracked over the course of about, I think, 2 months. And from that, they were able to quickly build an algorithm that could predict what every single person was going to do next, like 93.4% chance, analyzing just a month of geolocation data, where people were going to go and what they were going to do next with 93.4% accuracy. And that kind of shows the power of it. So there's a tremendous incentive to use it, drag it all into the light, and have everybody discuss it, and as a society decide where we're comfortable putting it. Now, in the past, technologies like the camera have freaked people out, and it takes decades for society to catch up with it. And this amazed me. I think the book was called, I can't remember the name of it, Tim Wu, I think the book was. But it was talking about how when the portable camera first came out, people were outraged, the idea that you could get your photo taken in the street. It's a tremendous privacy violation. And there were angry editorials, and it took 20 or 30 years for people to start to realize, oh, well, okay, we can manage this. So I think it'll follow very much like that. There will be litigation, there will be debate, there will be op-eds and legislation, and eventually we'll settle down, and we will have these 20, 30, 50 years from now.
That makes sense. Now, Google is working on a lot of new technologies, a lot of things that are sort of a little far out, and some more near term, some that have come out already that are probably pushing a little bit what society's okay with, and definitely changing behavior. There's a number of them we could talk about. I'm curious which of the projects that we're working on here are you excited about? Are you cautious about?
Sure. Wow, I'll try to be very politic as I say this, but automated cars I think are cool. Those were in Demon, not the same way. They don't kill people when you guys make them. But there was a really magical moment when I was up in Mountain View and they put me in the automated car and was driving down the highway. That was pretty freaky because I'd received a lot of emails from people saying, well, that's really cool in your book and all, but that's 30 or 40 or 50 years from now. And I was like, yeah, selfie, you know. But that's very cool. I think also I spent many years working in logistics software. I could immediately see the utility of that. I think automated vehicles in terms of logistics, it's just a no-brainer. It's going to be tremendously useful. And then the idea of having cars that are part-time autonomous and part-time's not. When you get down into a city core, having cars communicate with each other. It's like, look, you want to get here, we'll work it out. We'll do the every other merge. You guys screw it up. And that will make things more, it'll probably be, cars that are algorithmically written up to be jerks, right? They'll cut in. That's right. It'll be a particular brand of car. But no. Basically, that is interesting to me. We see things like Google Glass, I think, is a perfect example of it making people uncomfortable. And again, I think that bright line will be written by how people react to it. And we see that already. You occasionally see news items where people get very angry about it. But that is exactly that type of debate. Yeah. What will happen is it'll move back and forth. Maybe the camera goes off. Maybe it stays on. Maybe it looks at different data as opposed to just visual data. But that technology interests me tremendously because, of course, I had the heads-up glasses in Demon. It was for a different purpose. Yeah. It was to disrupt all of civilization. I don't think that's the purpose of what you guys do, clearly. But I think Google Glass interests me. Yeah, I know. I really wanted to hear well, hell no, man. But that interests me. Again, I could see it being tremendously useful because it frees the hands. Just that there's that component that people will weigh in on, I think, over the next few years. So.
Exactly.
Also, one more thing. Google Earth, Street View, just hands down the best writer research tool ever. I mean, it just is. I spend so much time. It's like if I want to travel to someplace, even if I'm going to go to a foreign location to do research, I can find out precisely where I want to go using it. I've discovered a certain location at the end of this book using Google Earth, which was a very improbable location, and yet I could get all of this. So yeah, so whoever here who works on that, thank you.
Nice, thank you. No, the Google Earth and maps are awesome. In terms of Influx, do you have any lessons or themes that you hope readers will take out of it?
Well, yeah. Again, this is probably not the audience I need to say it to. You guys would tell me this, and that is embracing change. Constant incremental change to me. The idea of creating a society that naturally embraces that and doesn't constantly try to set up the perfect order. Because there's no such thing as the perfect system. And it's in the same way that nature doesn't just say, well, that deer is perfect. We're done with deer now. Deer is solved. And I think that having an inherently open society naturally leads to this. It's again, when I look at societies like North Korea, for instance, I think even North Korean government said that they had perfected society. So they were like done with that. And that's a very worrisome thing because, again, everybody debating, arguing, freely exchanging ideas, even if they don't agree, especially if they don't agree, that to me is a vibrant civilization. One where people say what they think, try new things, and make mistakes. There was a sociological study. There's a sociologist who got a bunch of people together to solve a problem. And what he was looking at was group dynamics. And the problem was this. They had a pile of straws and a couple clips. And the goal was to try to see how quickly a small group of people could stack these the highest, to make the tallest sculpture. And they had MBAs, and they had military people, and they had physicians, and all these people tried to do it. And the winner, hands down, was 5-year-olds. Because they weren't afraid to fail. They would just immediately try a whole bunch of stuff rather than trying to reason it out like, well, if we do this, they would just do it and try it and fail and fail. And every time they failed, they would learn a bit. And they time and time again would win. So that's the sort of civilization I'd love to be part of, sort of a bunch of people trying and failing and constantly change. 5-year-olds, basically. Yeah, that came out poorly, but you know.
Nice. Well, we like to be like 5-year-olds here too. So, I guess to wrap up my questions before we open it up to the audience, can you give us like a bit of background in terms of how you got into science fiction writing from your tech consulting background, and then also where you see yourself going next?
Sure. Okay. I was a systems consultant for many years. I worked with big companies to solve complex logistical problems. Particularly the last 7 years I was working in that career. And that involved really trying to wring out a lot of efficiency in distribution networks. And I don't know, there's something, I'd been reading a lot of tech thrillers that kind of upset me because the technology sucked in them. You know, I'd read it and I was like, that's not possible. And then I was also trying to figure out a way to get across to other people that I knew some of the concerns I had about the way things were being designed, sort of how we were getting rid of resiliency, squeezing every ounce of fat out of our systems, whether they be transportation, energy, whatever it is, power. And then it just hit me that I'd like to write a thriller about it, because a white paper, nobody's going to read that. I actually was thinking of writing like an article and sending it into some software magazine. But I wound up writing a thriller, which was Demon, and I couldn't get a publisher or an agent for it, so then I self-published it. And then it just really succeeded beyond my wildest imagination. And from that point on, it made sense for me to continue writing them. First of all, I found it to be a lot of fun and very rewarding. Also, even though I wrote the first book under a pen name, Leonard Zeros, which is my name backwards, I did that, and it was very weak encryption. But the other thing is that gamers, this I thought was fascinating, gamers would look at that and say, Daniel Suarez. And it occurred to me the reason is, I don't know how many people have joined a system and seen your name is taken, so they just reverse the letters. And so a lot of gamers would look at my name and immediately recognize it. But when I finally sort of came out, and it turns out that I was this guy who was working for these big companies, and I wrote this hacking book about, tearing apart big companies, I was thinking, oh, this is going to be ugly. But it turns out a lot of those people said, hey, I'm writing a novel too. So I'm still friends with all of them, and it worked out very well. So I got to keep a lot of the people that I knew as friends, and started writing more and more books a little further afield from software. Of course, Kill Decision was all about robotics and drones. Yep. And I've always loved technology. I've always loved computers. But I don't have a computer science degree. I have an English literature degree. So I think I always took a very, I don't want to say holistic approach to technology, But a lot of what I would do, particularly when I was doing code reviews for big companies, is I would spend a great deal of time talking to the people to understand how the software got written, not just what was on, what was in every module, what the source code was, but under what conditions, what psychological environment people, or social environments probably better. And I had a great deal of success doing things like that, finding problems as a result of talking to the people and how they related to each other, not necessarily the code. So I sort of bring an English major sensibility to tech. And so I think that I'm continuing that with my books. I mean, I love talking to people, researchers, about new technologies they're working on, and then connecting these various components. A lot of my books, for instance, I combine existing technologies in new ways, in ways people might not have thought of. And that's, I think, why I love it so much. So I will continue doing that. I love writing books. And I'm no doubt going to continue writing tech thrillers. Sci-fi thriller, like I said, I put these generally in the same category. I'm just using a slightly different tool from the shelf to achieve a lot of the same ends. It's been said that sci-fi in general isn't never about the future, it's always about the present. And so in that sense, I don't think it's a big stretch to do a bit of sci-fi and then some tech thrillers. So.
Sounds great. We're excited to see the next stuff you work on.
So am I.
I have a question about Malaysia Air. And I think one of the things that people find so frustrating about the story is that because we're so now used to this technology being able to solve anything instantly, and we can see everything all the time and know everything, and everybody on that plane has a smartphone in their pocket, and yet it's gone, and it's a week now, and it's still a mystery.
Yes.
I wonder if you might talk about that sort of, and why I think it's befuddling people so much, and bringing up a lot of conspiracy theories, and I think a big part of that is related to we can't believe in this age that this can happen.
This is a great question, actually. It really is. Because I obviously have been, for future audiences who look at this, around the time that this is taped, a Malaysian airliner has disappeared. And with all hands, it doesn't look like it's crashed. Because of the Rolls-Royce engines had some sensors in them that every 30 minutes would report by a satellite that they were up to stuff aside from being on the bottom of the ocean. So I think what this does is brings up a great point. People think of technology as this monolithic solution that just deals with things, when really there are these tiny little data points or connections of how it connects to the rest of society. I think a lot of us might have been surprised that, like, how could an entire airliner not be on radar screen at all time? But they aren't, apparently. Aside from military radars, which are very closely held in secret, both their sweep and the extent of the stations they have, civilian radar, a lot of it is augmented by transponders on machines. So here, if it has in fact been stolen and spirited away to some other location as opposed to crashing, there was a knowledgeable person, a person knowledgeable about these systems, and just the few connection points that connected it to the rest of society, which is, the transponders get turned off. There was, I think, also a mapping module that gets turned off for navigation. They, of course, if they have satellites, a cell phone on board, they can turn off that transceiver so they're not making satellite connections. And then from there, they can change. Now, my understanding was that the belief is that they went down another air corridor that's pretty heavily traveled that would go either to the Middle East or Europe. And so they blended in with traffic. Anybody looking at a plane is just going to think it's a plane and assume that all of their transponders would be on. It is amazing that in 2014, you could basically disappear with an entire plane filled with people. But I'll bet that as a result of what happens, because we haven't seen the other shoe drop on this, because was it stolen? What happened to the people on it? And if so, what is going to be done with it? Is it going to be rebranded, repainted, and used for some terrible purpose, or is this just a mistake? Did it crash? The process by which we track planes, I think, is going to change as a result. It definitely is, because the fact that everyone's looking for it and it just disappeared, that's shocking. And it shocks me. And again, every time these types of things happen, I bookmark a lot of stuff and I research stuff. And whenever one of these things happen, and not to make light of it, but whenever there is some calamity, my inbox fills up. Somebody revives a 60,000-year-old virus, and man, you have to have this as your next book. You got to do it here. It's like sometimes it's too low-hanging fruit. It's a little obvious. But in the case of technology gone awry, I do take a great interest in it. So that's why I was very excited when you asked the question, because how tenuous the thread is, what connects us to the rest of society, particularly when you're out. This is why I like the movie Castaway, for instance. You look at it, it's like, he should be, oh, that's right, you can't. Because we really have lanes, across these vast spaces. And civilization really kind of frays at the edge. And I don't know, I guess we'll find out what happens to it. Gee, dare I make a prediction? I do think they will find that plane. I hope that the people involved are still alive, being kept somewhere. I hope. But I think it's the best case scenario is somebody was just stealing a plane. That seems very unlikely. But it will probably find it abandoned somewhere when they realize that they figured out that it didn't crash. And probably, months from now, they'll find it in some hangar somewhere on the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean. And hopefully the people are okay. So I hope that answered your question.
Well, it's a good sign. The very first page of your book is intriguing to me, that says the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed.
Yeah, it's William Gibson, yeah.
And I think, when you talk about people fearing technology, there is, the sort of status quo fear of it. But there's also this fundamental fear that technology will drive us further apart and be more polarizing. And I wonder if you could comment on the future of technology as a way to bring people closer together.
Yeah, okay, so the question being that is technology, is that fear valid in any way? That increasing technology will bring us further apart as opposed to connecting us. I find the Amish to be very interesting in this case because I never thought that the Amish could use cell phones, but apparently they can. And talking to Kevin Kelly's like this great expert on the Amish. That's why he's got the beard, I guess. But he when he was writing about this, what amazed me in What Technology Wants, which is a book he wrote, it's a fascinating book, highly recommended. He talks about how they will ingest technology into Amish society, and their sole, very purposeful direction there is to make sure that it doesn't break up their community. That's it. That's the sole overriding. So they, for instance, will have, and this part amazed me, Amish maids running CNC milling equipment. I mean, programming these, because for work purposes, they're allowed to use computers and robotic arms and all of this other stuff. Amish people with the cap and everything. Then when they go home, though, they don't use it there. So the idea is when you're in a workplace, you can use very different technology sets than when you're at home. And so for using a cell phone, they would have some distance away on the edge of their property, a box holding their cell phones, because you don't want that phone. You want to make it so that you absolutely need to use it. And so otherwise, if you're not needful of having to have a long-distance conversation, you'll talk to the people around you. So that was their focus. And a lot of that makes sense, really. I think when we sit around in places where everybody's on their cell phone, I think we'll get through that type of, I don't want to say dysfunction, but alienation in a few years. I think, again, we'll come to some social contract, some agreement. And we see this now already, where it's okay to use a cell phone, where people frown on it. I don't know how many of you have gone to a dinner where everybody piles the phone up and the first person to use it has to buy a round of drinks. That's a perfect example of this like penalty system for misusing technology in the social context. But we'll still have them. And I do think they bring us closer together. There's people that I would not have talked to, people I went to high school that I'm now still very close with because of technology. The depth of that relationship and like how deep we get, that sure, you could make an argument that having 20,000 social media friends is not friends. So let's choose a different word. But I still think that we're more connected and more social than if we didn't have these technologies. I will say, though, that there is an aspect of it where, how to put this, we have to be mindful of what the purpose is of the system. In other words, if the system is to drive advertising or do something else, everybody just needs to be aware of that. And in other words, what you actually see, what is put before you as important, I think there needs to be some clarity there. Because if in any way there are algorithms weighing in that somehow modify your social circle, that is keenly interesting to me. Because to the extent that we control our social circle and see the things that we direct what we see, I think it's very interesting and very positive. It's where you have the power of software enabling things to happen invisibly. Again, I'm one of those people who always wants to basically tear the black box open and take a look at it. Now, that's not always possible in modern society, obviously, but that's my impulse. I tend to think of the social, how would I put it? Well, these networks are becoming society. And to that degree, it's sort of a civic concern. So I like to understand the inner workings of it. Again, for the same reason, I don't want my phone doing a bunch of things I didn't ask it to do, or didn't agree to. If I have any concerns, that's where they lie. But I do think technology, by and large, makes society function much more smoothly and can put people in touch with each other who never would meet. And there are literally hundreds of examples of that for myself. I have been connected with so many readers by email and then later social media. And then just right now in South by Southwest, I met a great many readers who turned out to be very cool people that I don't think I would have as easily met if it wasn't for this technology. So it's hard to say that that's not a social boon. So.
I think you're, yeah, go for it.
Hello.
So would you agree that technology begets technology, so computers enable better computers, and the internet helps us build a better internet? Like, do you think we're accelerating, and then do you ever think about an end game where suddenly we just...
Singularity City, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think about that more or less all the time, because that's kind of my job now. It's like, it can be unhealthy. It's like, what's your job? Well, I think about how the world's going to end, mostly. No. And by the way, I'm not a doom and gloom guy at all. Just to preface this, I am very optimistic about where technology will bring us. I like to think what I do is sort of like spotting icebergs. I might suggest some course corrections, but I'm still happy I'm on the boat. And I'll give you a good example of yes, I do think technologies, they sort of catapult us to different, higher orbits in a way. And to me, an apt example would be the cell phone was around for many years, and the computer was around for many years. And then somebody shrunk it down into this handheld thing called a smartphone, and boom, a whole different thing happened. Both of those technologies existed, but combining them together in a mobile platform changed everything. I think we're going to see a lot of that in coming years, which is what's going to make, like robotics is a good example. We will wrestle as a society with automation and robotics. I think a great many good things will happen. And I think the parable here is that idea of the last company to make buggy whips. They made the best damn buggy whips ever, but eventually we didn't need them anymore. And yet, a lot of horses lost their jobs and there was a big shift, but I think we will endeavor to do other things. So the hope is that that is what happens, that new industries are created. Again, software jobs, and they didn't exist. So we're going to have upheaval in the meantime, though. I think some serious upheaval in terms of job loss, dislocation. And it's getting through those that I think are going to be our challenge, not where we're going. I think as a species, as a society, as a civilization, the more technology we have, well, we're going to need it. We're going to need it because we have some very serious problems in terms of climate change. And that's just for starters. But also dealing with large numbers of people at a time of climate change. That's going to be a whole other thing, rapidly shifting populations. And then there's space. That, to me, is the logical thing to do next. I think it's about time we got busy on that. And there's plenty of room out there, so we're going to need every bit of our technological know-how to keep us alive out there. And not only that, but to build sustainable, self-enclosed biospheres. I mean, there's so many challenges for us, and technology will make it all possible. I'm very excited about it. I think we will go in leaps. We'll have these pivotal inventions that take us to the next level. There will be disruption centered around those leaps, but getting to the next level to me is I guess it's like a game. I'm a big game fan, and getting to the next level is literally what we're trying to do, time and time and time again. And as far as game over, sure, I guess the game will be over eventually, but I don't know, not for a long time. Hopefully a long, long, long time.
What are you guys?
You said you were an optimist, and I think I'm optimistic by nature, but I'm not sure it's. Sometimes with technology, it doesn't seem rational. I mean, if you think about, I don't know, maybe do you address like the Bill Joy / Kaczynski / Kurzweil, discussion argument a little?
Yeah. Okay. Is optimism rational when it comes to technology? Actually, it's a fair point. It really is. But I would say this. I look at technologies like the blinding laser. This is an immensely effective weapon. It is insidious. It's cheap. You can blind everybody on a battlefield. If you have the proper swiveling head, anybody who's looking is blinded for good. And yet they're not used. There's a prohibition against them. Pretty much every country says, no, let's not use these. And that, to me, right there is a slice of optimism, that there's limit. Again, we've had nuclear weapons for half a century now. We're still here. That has another tremendous, tremendous argument in our favor. I think we're capable of pulling back from the brinks, that there's things we'll do, even in large numbers, and things we won't do. So it's that sociability of mammals, I think. And this was one of the reasons why I was so concerned about automation of warfare with robotics, is because if we take these evolved prohibitions or limits to violence out of the system, and instead we imbued robots with a sort of an insectoid or a colony brain, and again, you give it the same brain as a species that's not concerned about self-preservation because it has a queen that does that. See, again, the fact that I gave that TED Talk and talked about it, and a lot of people afterwards were talking to me about it, people in very interesting positions, that gives me optimism. The fact that they can hear these reasoned arguments and say, well, that might be good in the short term, but let's not do it. I mean, we're still here. Our lifespans are pretty much doubled from what they were a century ago. A lot of that's technology and reason. Yes, there's horrible warfare, but on the whole, warfare is going down. It's hard not to be a bit optimistic about that. Now, again, that's not, what do they say? Past results don't guarantee future results. But I think that technology is pretty much the best thing we have going. And really what it is it's a physical manifestation of the human will. It's reason. It's reason personified. That's what I like about technology. Because you can see how it's used, you can talk about how it was constructed, and then modify it. And then we can have that constant iterative conversation. That's, to me, what technology represents, which is why I'm optimistic about it. But then you're right, there are occasional ones that make you wonder, like, oh, how long are we going to be here? But thankfully, that's not all the time. Most of the time when I see a new technology, I think, oh, cool, they're doing that now. I think medieval farmers probably didn't have as much entertainment, as far as that goes. It's like, wow, we're still doing crops just like we did, and my father. We get a much more interesting life cycle for technology.
So this is a little bit of a two-part question. Everybody else has asked you a bunch of really cool questions about technology. My question is more about the writing side of things.
Okay.
So I really enjoy your books.
Thank
a
you.
couple of my friends just pestered me over and over. You have to read Demon. You have to read Demon. And I
Thank
finally
them for that,
picked it up,
please.
and it was great. And I think your books they're really good at sucking you in. I've been a voracious reader my entire life, and the best books are the ones where I sit down and I'm reading the book, and the entire world is just not interesting to me. And when I'm not reading the book, I'm plotting how to get back to reading the book until I'm finished. And so I think you do a really good job of structuring the books and making them readable in that sense. And I was wondering what your process is for doing that. Are you somebody who has a really strong outline before you start, or do you like, okay, I've got an end point and I'm going to sort of make it up as I go along and just naturally where the characters take me and connect from here? And the second piece is I've had a lot of good luck over the years discovering new people through existing authors. So I now have, Daniel Suarez comes out with a new book. I'm going to pick that up.
Cool.
Good. But are there people like that for you? Who are you reading who you think is doing really interesting things right now? Because hopefully there's somebody on that list that I don't have on mine.
Okay. The first question is a great question. I like talking about the craft of writing. That effect that you talk about where your sensory perception is overridden by fiction, I call that casting the spell, essentially, because I enjoy it when it happens to me, when I'm reading a book and then I forget that I'm a person sitting in a chair. I'm instead in some medieval place or whatever. That is really, talk about an amazing technology. That somebody could squiggle things and that we could make that work at all is just mind-blowing. It really is. So I have great awe for that rather old, amazing technology. As far as how I go about crafting a book, I very definitely use an outline. And maybe that's the software guy in me or designing databases. But thrillers in particular are all about pacing. I suppose I acquired the skill set to do this by reading a bunch of thrillers and books, but also, actually, I think a big piece of it was role-playing games. I used to be a DM, second edition D&D, and if you want honest feedback, I must tell you, having a group of teenage guys or college-level guys around, you will get immediate, very honest feedback about how things are going. So that gives you a sense of pacing, story pacing, because it is very much a knife's edge when you're talking about a suspense or thriller book. If it's going too easy, it gets boring. If it's too hard, it's frustrating. And so what I simply do is write a lot. I'll typically write twice as much as I need to, and then I will let it cool off for a while. Now, again, I will do most of the writing. I'd say most of the writing process is in the planning, is in structuring. I will typically start with a 3-act structure with certain key points, turning points, the first act turning point, second act turning point, as a framework. Now that still leaves a lot of room for individual creativity, but this tripartite structure has been very powerful. The archetypes, long stories from many years ago follow this structure, and it seems to map pretty well with the human brain. Let's face it, just a beginning, middle, end. I mean, right there, that just makes sense. And to be cognizant of that structure as you build it is very key with me. And then basically I will write a lot and then take a machete to it later. That to me is the key thing, being able to be honest with yourself about what works and what doesn't. Having an internal editor is so important, because I find when I take about half of my book away, it's a lot better, a lot tighter. I don't know what process other writers use, but that is very definitely one. So yeah, it involves writing about 300,000 words for a 150,000 word book. But the other thing I would say is when you're starting out a book, I'll run into people who have a great deal of difficulty getting started on the book because they're focused like, how do I begin this? And I just say, just write it, because that first chapter, it's doomed. Don't even think it's going to be in the book. I mean, why have any stress over something that you're absolutely going to delete later because you're going to hate it? Because what's going to happen is you're going to go, even if you have a very careful structure, you're going to go write that whole book, and really, for me, that first chapter is so important. Typically, it's best informed by the rest of the book that follows it. So that when I'm done with the book, I'll go back to the first chapter and find out all of these seeds and threads that I need to plant and tie back in. I'll typically go back and weave threads, various subplots and stories throughout the whole book, and have them surface at important points to reinforce things, themes, characters. Yeah, so you can see, you can wind me up. I love talking the craft of writing because in many ways it is programming. It's, things have to compile. In the human brain, it's like, that's not compiling. And I guess character names are variables, but I'll finish it there. Yeah, so that's generally how I do it. And the other one was, who am I reading right now? Or what authors do I really like? I read a lot of nonfiction, so I'm going to try to focus on some fiction writers. I just read, Name of the Wind. What is it? Yes, it has a cool name. I remember, what is it again? Patrick Rothfuss. I enjoyed that very much. I think also I tend lately to be reading some medieval fantasy books because I've read so many thrillers that I keep looking for the scaffolding. All of the things that I just described to you, I'd be like, well, where's the second act turning point? It's sort of like knowing that as a craft makes it tough sometimes to read them. Although I just read Andy Weir's book, A Martian, loved it, just absolutely loved it. And what I loved in particular about his book is he does not shrink away from science. For those who are unfamiliar with his book, he basically has a guy find himself stranded on Mars as part of a team and using all of the science and scientific knowledge at his disposal to survive. And I found it to be very interesting. And it's not like I don't know how many people remember Robinson Crusoe on Mars. No, it's not that. He does not run into a Friday who's dropped. No, it's a much more realistic book, and I enjoyed it very much. But again, I enjoyed it because he did the heavy lifting. He did a lot of research to really back it up with science, and then he wove a story into it that had a really compelling pace. And it was constantly raising the stakes. That's another thing with a thriller, is you want to be raising the stakes. And it sounds kind of cheesy when I say it like that, but in effect, that's building that action, involving us more, having characters we care about. That's another thing. That's something that, for instance, I don't get a lot when I see some movies. There's a lot of big action movies. Very often I'll be finding myself saying, why do I care about this person? It's like, because I'm told to. That's not enough. You know, and when it's done right and you get your buttons pressed, you don't mind getting your buttons pressed. But if you get sore about it, it's not being done well. So hopefully I answered your two questions.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
I think we have time for one more. Yeah, go for it.
So I guess my question is about the people social aspect.
Yes.
You gave the example of the camera, and over the course of time, through back and forth discussion and op-eds and everything else, people slowly began to accept it. But in this time, our social discourse isn't nearly as polite, and it's a lot more I'm right, you're wrong, and that's final, and not this back and forth discussion. And I wonder what you think that's going to play into this forward progress of technology when people
Sure.
are saying, I'm right, you're wrong,
Yes.
that's it.
I feel better about that for this reason. I'm trying to remember the election. I think it was the election of the 1880s, and whoever was running for office then, it's like one of these Taft presidents, guys you barely remember. But his opponent at the time in the newspapers accused him of being a cannibal. And I thought, wow, man, talk about swimming. So apparently, going back to the time of Benjamin Franklin, Jefferson, all these pamphlets would just be out, political, in other words, just the most vile lies about people. And it's, when you take a look at that past and think about how we do things now, it's almost genteel. It's like, I really don't agree with you. I think you're a terrible person, not that you're a cannibal. So I think that history shows us that we really haven't changed all that much. And if we have, we are mindful of how we'll look when somebody does a Google search on us. You'll sound like a raving lunatic if you said somebody was a cannibal. But I don't think that I don't know, the cordiality of it is as necessary. And maybe it's because I grew up going through the New Jersey public school system. But I think a vigorous debate, let's call it, is a huge corrective for us. I think being polite to each other isn't as... Now, you were also talking about deliberate mistruths, I imagine, right? People digging in their heels, and that old idea that you're entitled to your opinion but not your facts. That, to me, is the bigger challenge, is muddying the waters with fake facts. And, boy, this is where I'll go on a soapbox about education. Public school education in New Jersey in 1970s, I got a tremendously good education. In particular, I mean, we had formal logic, right? To learn how to think critically. This, to me, is a big thing that again, I don't have kids, so sorry for those. But as far as education goes, I think that should be one of the overriding purposes, is to learn how to think, not necessarily rote memory of all these thoughts, and to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff using your own brain, to look at the evidence. That's the thing that I think is missing in society right now, generally. And I think it makes people susceptible to some highly questionable opinions about things, very uninformed opinions about things, because it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. If you have the ability to separate fact from fiction, or at least give it a good shot, you should be able to chain together causation and come to a reasonable conclusion as a member of a civil society. And boy, that sounds very optimistic, I know. But it's happened before. And again, I think about my education, again, a public school education. I was able to work alongside people from all around the world, my clients. And my education held up to anywhere. And that always reassures me that it's absolutely possible. We just need to try to instill that in the next generation is a big challenge, I know, particularly in a very politicized environment. But that would be it. Teaching people how to think critically and analyze evidence will help us get rid of at least moderate the influence of basically bullshit. So
Nice. Daniel told me he's happy to stay for a little bit, sign books for you guys. But
Happy to.
in the meantime, thank you so much for
Oh,
coming.
it was my
for the
pleasure.
thought-provoking
Absolutely my
discussion.
pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.